Thanks very much, Adam, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. I want to talk primarily around diesel technology and the challenges in Europe, and use that really as a lens to look at the wider challenges for diesel technology around the world. After all, what's going on in Europe is not just about Europe, as more and more regions around the world, to one degree or another, emulate the European regulatory structure. It's actually of global relevance. And we have been conducting significant on-road test programs over the last 5 years. And so I wanted to share with you our learnings from that and insights from that data to what those prospects are for RDE and also the remaining challenges. And in a nutshell, what the problem is with diesel in Europe is as follows. NOx emissions are 4 times the regulated levels. And that's been pretty much constantly the case for the last 5 years, and possibly further back, but that predates our testing program. If we look at to complete the picture, the fuel economy side of it is currently for 2016 model year vehicles, MPG is 29% worse on a real driving cycle than the official figures. And what that means for carbon dioxide emissions is it's about 41% above official levels, and those gaps are growing all the time. But more than that, there's actually a huge, those are the average figures, but there's massive variation around that mean as well. And so you get some manufacturers who are much worse than that, and others which are closer to the standard. But these are for vehicles which are homologated to the same legal standard. And it's a very interesting question to understand, how that can be the case and what that means for the regulations currently. So that's the sort of status as it is today. What's going to happen in the immediate future? There's obviously a number of new regulations coming along, lots more activity since Dieselgate. Our view is that it will certainly improve the situation, but it is not going to solve the problem. And we think RDE on the NOx regulations will be fairly successful, and the WLTC for fuel economy and CO2 measurement will be not quite so successful. It'll partially address the problem, but I'll explain in this presentation why I think that they have there's some weaknesses there, and why that there is an interaction with the NOx side that needs to be understood. As some of you may not know much about us, just in very brief terms, what we do, we've been going for 5 years and have ongoing test programs on the road in the UK, in Germany, and down in California. And we do PEMS testing, so portable emissions testing, and nothing else. We have decided that we wanted to be a focus on that and become a complete specialist in that area. Over the last 5 years, we've tested now well over 1,200 different vehicles. I don't mean different tests, I mean discrete different vehicles. About 2/3 in Europe, 1/3 in the US. And we offer that data as a commercially available database. So anyone, whether it is everyone from manufacturers to regulators to media, can actually get an immediate drill down into real world performance and comparisons of their own vehicles to rival vehicles without actually having to conduct own bespoke test programs. I'm not going to dwell on the technology of it, but that's what it is. We use Sensors equipment, Sensors of Michigan. It's performed very well as equipment. It is, even though what we do is not type approval regulatory testing, we actually use regulatory approved equipment and operate it to regulatory standards. We haven't invented some equipment ourselves and go completely off-piste. We try and adopt as many of the rigors of regulation in the laboratory as you possibly can do while doing it on the road. And so in a nutshell, what our concept is, before I then move on to what the data is telling us, is that the laboratory is fantastic for many things, but it is not particularly good for actually really understanding how vehicles are used in real world. And so there's a balance between the reproducibility of the laboratory against the authenticity of doing it on the road. And so we think what you can do is use PEMS on the road and carefully control and QA your data to get as many of the levels of precision and repeatability, but you are ultimately measuring the authentic thing you want to measure. It also has advantageous economics of testing as well, which allows you to increase your sample size in very simple terms, test more cars more often, and get to a level of overall greater confidence in what is going on. And we now test approximately over 500 vehicles each year now in these rolling test programs for greenhouse gases and for pollutant emissions. And the key thing is they're all tested in the same way. So same cycles, same conditioning protocols, very small team of drivers trained to drive in the same way, which allows us to compare vehicle A to vehicle B, including even some of the more exotic vehicles. So our test program has very wide applications, and so we've tested everything from heavy-duty trucks, NRMM, through to high-performance sports cars. So that's the new Lamborghini Huracan, which was tested recently down in Los Angeles. So that's what we do. And moving on to then what does it say about RDE and the European regulations? Well, there's basically three tracks of what's going on at the moment in Europe. There are the improvements to the type approval framework, which was really given a boost after Dieselgate, and to essentially tighten up and remove many of the loopholes that were in the regulation. Then there's the WLTC for the fuel economy and CO2 regulation, which I'll come and talk to in a second. And then there's the 4 packages of real driving emissions. Package 1 established PEMS as the preferred test method, rather than randomized cycles in the laboratory. Then package 2 was the one which was given a real boost after Dieselgate, which was the actual regulated levels and the conformity factors. So the 2.1 conformity factor, which comes in from next year, was instigated then, and that is a published regulation. We're now in the final stages of package 3, which adds, importantly, cold start to the RDE and also particle number regulation, which is in the final stages of being nailed down. And then the 4th package, which should be, discussion should start officially quite soon, is about in-service surveillance. And that's where our data becomes particularly relevant. And I think the success or otherwise of RDE will rest a lot on this package 4, which is what methods are used for checking the vehicles actually in use operation actually do still conform to their regulatory level. This is how the regulations are proposed to be tightened. So there is significant tightening on the NOx side, which is coming along, and also on the CO2 side with the fleet averages. But I'm not going to dwell on that because I want to really compare side by side how these tests apparently are conducted. And I think RDE, there's 2 parts of it. The first 2 columns are about the CO2 regulations with NEDC versus WLTC. And then you have real driving emissions compared to how we conduct tests. So the first thing on the CO2 side, the reason we are a bit skeptical about the effectiveness of WLTC is the problem is this 41% gap. We think it'll close that gap by about half. Now, why is that the case? We think that that will largely come from the removal of the loopholes in the regulations as they currently stand, not from the change of the driving cycle. Yet most of the focus for WLTC has been on the change to the driving cycle. The reason we don't think the driving cycle will make so much difference is if you compare the average speeds, accelerations, and gradients between WLTC and NEDC, well, actually, WLTC is faster, but that actually could be beneficial. The acceleration rates are actually fractionally less on average, and there's still no gradients involved. So actually, the cycle itself is, let's say, about the same, maybe slightly harder, but it'll be all the surrounding stuff in the protocol that matters. Then on the NOx side, which is particularly relevant for the diesels, RDE versus how we do it, we think there's a lot of variability in how the manufacturers can conduct the tests, and that's how it's been defined. and cycles have to conform with boundary conditions, and there's post-test normalization. But in short, we think that the issue is that it'll mean that the normalization process almost has to do too much work versus, and there is too much inherent variability potentially in how the original test is conducted. We take a slightly different view, is you want to keep the test itself as consistent as possible. So we have one cycle which is consistent throughout all our tests. We do have a normalization tool, but we want that to have to do as little work as possible. And so the potential is in that variability in how the test can be conducted within RDE and the way the normalization tool works, that there could be ways of gaming the system which are then built in. And that is why package 4 is so important, is the in-service surveillance needs to make sure that actually whatever happens at the type approval stage with PEMS, that does faithfully reflect what then ultimately goes on to happen on the road. So then if we jump into what does our data say for the situation? Well, we've plotted here for Euro 5 and Euro 6 diesels, what the conformity factor, so by that the ratio of real-world driving to the regulated level, looks like since we started back in 2011. And in short, there's been a very slightly improving trend, but basically it is about 4 times the limit. Whether it's a Euro 5 car or a Euro 6 car, it's about stuck at 4 times the limit on the current regulations. There was a slight improvement, a dip in the second quarter of 2014, when a large number of actually very clean Euro 6 diesels were brought to the marketplace, which gave a temporary fillip to the situation and made it look like the improvement trend might be more swift. But that turned out to be illusory, and it ticked back up to almost 4 again. And the issues with real driving emissions, which is why, in a way, we think it will drive an improvement, but it won't be as fast as people expect, is that actually the 2.1 conformity factor, which comes in next year, starts to come in from next year, is actually, for most people, pretty easy to achieve. And I'm going to show you why I think that in a second. The 1.5 conformity factor, which is the harder level to achieve, doesn't come fully into force until January 2021. So still many years away before it fully bites. Plus, the European Commission is committed to reviewing those conformity factors over time, but that doesn't formally guarantee that there will be any further reductions in the conformity factor. I mean, chances are probably there will be, but there's no guarantee on what that level would be or the timing of it. The second issues are around the normalization tools. So it's running two different normalization tools called MROAD and CLEAR, which use two completely different principles of normalizing the results. Plus, there are also discussions around something called a transfer function, which is a sort of a normalization tool on top of a normalization tool. Now, I'm not going to go into the inner details of these because it's not directly relevant. The issue is that it is creating a very complex regulation which will inevitably have elements which can be exploited, optimized over time. Plus also, I think it is setting up an asymmetry between manufacturers and regulators, an asymmetry of resources and skills. And the resources within Europe to actually monitor what goes on are relatively limited. And so if there is a regulation which is essentially overly complex, it sets up a potential situation for that asymmetry to be used. PEMS as well, I think that in addition to the the NOx regulations, the particle number regulation will be probably introduced next year as well, which I think it's important to do, but I have a question on timing in terms of the test equipment is relatively unproven, so it's relatively recent to the market. It looks quite promising, but it took years for gas PEMS to get all the gremlins out of the system and to become a really robust proposition. So I think we're going to have some I think actually the industry pushback on PEMS is valid, because I think the timing is probably just a little bit too aggressive. Now, in the light of Dieselgate, I sort of understand why there is a strong push, but I think in this case it may be practically overstretching. And I've talked about the structural issues already. So to the very bold question, will real driving emissions help? I think the answer is yes, it will, but it will take some time. And in the transitionary period of about 5 years, we will see a huge disparity of performance. And to put up some very simple logic to underpin that, this graph, each dot here is a European car we've tested. Blue is Euro 5 and orange is Euro 6, compared to the horizontal lines, which are the regulatory limits. So you have the solid orange line is the 80 milligrams. That is 1.5 conformity factor, and 2.1 conformity factor just tucked slightly underneath the actual Euro 5 limit. So for 2.1, which comes in next year, that means 2.1 times 80 milligrams per kilometre is 168. Then, okay, there's some variability, test-to-test variability with PEMS equipment. Let's be generous and say that's 30%. So knock 30% off 168, and you get to 129 milligrams that OEM has to shoot for to make sure they don't get caught out in a conformity test. And essentially, today, 20% of cars on the market actually meet that limit with no change whatsoever. There's also another bunch which lurk just above the dotted line, which are ones with very simple changes can be made to meet that level. So actually, a large proportion of cars on the market today actually can meet RDE next year with relatively few modifications to the vehicles. It's only these few up here, the orange ones dotted down here, which will have more significant problems. So actually, basically a long transition period has been given despite Dieselgate for this NOx compliance ultimately to be achieved. But I do think once we get there in 5 years' time, we will see NOx emissions levels substantially below what we've seen historically, and the conformity factor in practice substantially lower as well. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I wanted to highlight one aspect, because I mean, the primary discussion here is around NOx and NOx abatement. But there is one interesting aspect on the official figures in Europe that should be highlighted, which is there is a general perception in Europe that real-world fuel economy has been on an ever-improving trend, and that's not true. It is true for gasoline, which is the solid yellow line there. But if we look at the solid black line, which is our real-world fuel economy for diesels, it's actually been falling since 2012, which broadly speaking correlates to, as the interest in NOx abatement really started ramping up, actually it has been having a negative effect on the fuel economy of diesel vehicles. And it's, in a way, been accelerating in the last year, despite the fact that the official diesel kept rising until 2015. So it's not, in seeing these regulations in context, it's important to see there is, at a macro level, a trade-off going on between those two things. Now, the technical reason for those trade-offs is many and complex. I completely understand that. But just from that simple macro point of view, in order to clean up NOx, Europe, for diesel cars, has been suffering a fall in the real-world MPG for the last 3 years. And what's been, and that's another way of showing that actually it is this 40% average gap on, well, 29% gap on MPG that's been growing. It's been driven by these diesel cars. This is the gap to official over time. And it's the widening gap has been driven by the diesel cars more so than the gasoline cars. And it's particularly around the very small vehicles, both diesel and gasoline, where the biggest gaps happen. So this is the engine size class, and this is the gap to official. It's the very smallest cars which have the biggest gaps to official. So as that trend for downsizing has sort of collided with the need for NOx abatement, that's what's driven a lot of the widening gap. And I think there are already news stories now in Europe about manufacturers either discontinuing small diesels or reversing the trend of downsizing and upsizing the size of the engine, because there's a realization, and empirically, our data would suggest is below about 1.5 litre engine, you're into a world of actually diminishing fuel economy and real-world driving. So there is a limit to downsizing, and I think in Europe we've passed it. In the US, you're still on the right side of that, but actually the inflection point is higher than you would think. Just to put it in context as well, because everyone thinks of RDE as this fantastic new shiny, solve all problems, panacea regulation. Well, actually, on the US system, even though it is completely in the laboratory, has been doing for a long period a lot better job. So from our test data in the US, we can track the gap between the EPA 5-cycle sticker fuel economy and CO2 and the real world. And what we find is that there's no gap, and hasn't been for the last three or so years. If you look at regular gasoline vehicles, which is the orange, the yellow line, it's hobbled, sort of fluctuated around zero. So a US consumer buying off the sticker label is being given about the right answer on MPG. So it's an interesting reflection for RDE. In a way, you don't need PEMS to have an official system that properly reflects what's going on. It is more complex than that. But it's not, I don't want everyone to think that the US system is in any way perfect. If you unpack that average variance of zero and look at it from OEM to OEM, you've got, the best case, this OEM here, which is on average 10% better than their sticker number, to this OEM here, which is more than 10% worse than their sticker number on average. So that average is hiding quite a lot of manufacturer to manufacturer variability, which is about technology mix and approach to testing, in my view. And what we have outside, we are just launching this US database. So actually, this data will be available, so manufacturers can actually benchmark their performance in real-world driving and see how they stand along this axis. And finally, to really further emphasize that actually RDE and WLTC have got quite a large challenge, and Europe has considered itself as the leader in greenhouse gas thought and regulation for a long time. It's not really true. If we look at the average, this is the average CO2 in real-world driving here. The US gasoline is this orange line, and European gasoline is the blue line. Actually, European gasoline, it's been converging quite rapidly with the US, and it's likely in 2017 to about meet. So it's not as if Europe on gasoline has any particular advantage. The only advantage that Europe gets for its overall CO2 is by the presence of diesel in the fleet. That's what drives it. And so that is why this is therefore relevant, is that when we're talking about the future of diesel and the cost versus benefit of after-treatment systems, it has to be seen in the greenhouse gas context as well, is that that is the main benefit that Europe is deriving by presence of diesel in the fleet. And so can diesel be clean is a crucial question in answering, can Europe hold on to diesel technology for passenger cars? If it can't hold on to diesel for passenger cars, then it immediately loses that CO2 advantage. Okay, and so finally, so that's what our data it says about the coming regulations in Europe. But coming back to package 4 of RDE, which is, as I've said, that's the bit I think where RDE will probably succeed or fall, is on the in-service surveillance of it. There is only so much that type approval system can do. You need to have a very, very active in-service surveillance. I don't mean conformity of production, I mean in-service surveillance through some useful life of the vehicle. That is essential to the success of the regulation. So what we did, because we run these rolling test programs, we thought, well, actually, in essence, what we do is an in-service surveillance program already on both sides of the Atlantic. So how could this be actually contribute to the debate and be useful both to consumers and manufacturers? So what we did earlier this year in April, we started launching a ratings program called the EQA index. EQUA doesn't actually stand for anything. It just sort of sounds like the right sort of thing. So I won't go into the branding details. But it was, the idea was something which would be a consistent, user-friendly, scientific but not too arcane, that can be used essentially to correct what I see as a market failure. The market failure at the moment is there are actually good diesel technologies out there, but consumers think all diesels are dirty. They also think all Volkswagens are bad. And anyone who's got a good diesel technology actually is struggling to indicate to the market that that diesel technology is a good technology, good clean technology, because in a way no one's listening at the moment because they think all diesels are dirty. So we thought that this could be a way, a proactive way of trying to address that market failure. So we started publishing our data, the top level data. We completely understand that this has no statutory basis whatsoever. So we decided to get our authority by submitting our data to a panel of academic experts who scrutinized the methodology in the data, including Imperial College in London, Cambridge University, and including John German from the ICCT, who was obviously intricately involved in Dieselgate. And in a nutshell, it's to go, right, you've got Euro regulations which are a pass-fail. Let's take this to the next level, which is let's create a discriminator. Let's say, okay, they're all Euro 6s, but which ones are cleaner than the others? And so so we're putting a robust, independent standard into the marketplace. We have no axe to grind. We just want to put good data out there. And that's what it looks like. So we started publishing this in April in Europe, and you'll see there's a rating scale, very simple, from A to H, where A is the cleanest, H is the dirtiest. But what you'll notice, a key point you'll notice, is the vehicle is actually specified to a very tight degree of technical specification. We're not talking at the generality of Volkswagen Golf diesel. It is down to transmission and power and down to a low level. So a manual can get a different rating from an automatic for a vehicle which is otherwise the same. I suppose the key thing to know is these are the ratings. So we've aligned the ratings, roughly speaking, to the regulated levels. So A to C is a 2.1 conformity factor and roughly the same as Euro 5. D is Euro 4, E is Euro 3. So it's very easy to interpret these results. But it's A. A, in short, means that it meets the 80 milligrams RDE regulation, even in real-world driving. So in a sense, in a way, that's what we're really looking for from RDE. We want vehicles to perform on the road in a compliant way to the regulations. So an A is what we're really looking for. A to C essentially means it meets the 2.1, and A and B, it meets 1.5. And when we launched in April, there were 6 vehicles that were on the market at that time that had A ratings of diesels. And they were all from the Volkswagen group. And no one believed us at the time. And subsequently, the regulators in Europe have done their own testing and checked, and in every case, the Euro 6 Volkswagens have come out as the cleanest. So we went into this with no understanding of what actually was going to be the end answer. This obviously surprised us when it came out, but it is true. And these are obviously not the affected EA 189 engines. That's important to say. So your question to me may be, well, what about the EA 189 engines? Well, actually, if we're looking at the ratings for the Euro 5 vehicles, those engines were only averagely dirty. So they were middle of the pack. They were not the standout dirty Euro 5 diesels. So when it comes to assessing, what has VW done in Europe, what's the potential liability for VW, all I can say is, as a matter of empirical fact, is that they were about averagely dirty. They did not stand out as doing something egregious. Now, it doesn't mean that maybe there's some technical illegality. I don't know, but they weren't super contributors to NOx emissions. We've subsequently launched a carbon monoxide index on exactly the same principles, because gasoline generally doesn't have the emissions problems of diesels, but it we've actually found that over 10% of vehicles do have CO emissions above the regulated levels in Europe. And that's clustered. One or two manufacturers tend to account for most of those that exceed. So, there are one or two issues on the CO side. And this will be more important for the US database that we're launching in a couple of weeks' time, that will focus on those ratings. And finally, we've also started publishing fuel economy and CO2 numbers as well to complete the package. And because we've tested so many vehicles, we're able to interpolate for those that we haven't tested. So actually, we publish fuel economy and CO2 numbers for 66,000 model variants in Europe. So it's essentially a complete alternative, real-world alternative to the official system, which is why I got into this business in the first place, was frustration with the official figures. So we've now, after 5 years of solid testing, able to give back to the marketplace what those real-world figures are. And I think this will be a very useful in-service surveillance for the WLTC program. So between EQA AQ on the NOx side and EQA MPG and CO2, we've got that data out there and we're tracking what's going on. We don't come at it from we're not environmental campaigners at all. We are very much not anti-industry at all. What we think the marketplace, and both consumers and manufacturers and all players in the marketplace need, is good currency data that can allow the market to function properly. And so I think we've got to that position now. So I think I will leave it there and throw myself open to any questions. And I'm on the panel afterwards as well. So I look forward to all your questions and thank you very much for listening.